The sterile white corridors of Detroit General Hospital echoed with my footsteps as I pushed the cleaning cart toward the pediatric ICU. It was 2:30 a.m., and most of the hospital slept in that eerie quiet that only medical facilities know. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm 17 years old, and to everyone here, I'm just another kid from the projects trying to make ends meet with a minimum wage cleaning job. But what they don't know could save a life tonight. 3 hours earlier, I had overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Dr. Harrison, the chief of neurology, was speaking in hushed, desperate tones with Richard Blackstone, the pharmaceutical billionaire whose 8-year-old son David had been admitted 2 days ago with what they're calling an unidentifiable neurological condition. Mr. Blackstone, I'm going to be completely honest with you, Dr. Harrison had said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. We've consulted with specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. David's brain inflammation is unlike anything we've seen. The seizures are increasing in frequency, and his cognitive function is deteriorating rapidly. We're estimating maybe 48 hours before... He couldn't finish the sentence. No parent should ever hear those words. That's when Richard Blackstone, all 6 feet of him in his $5,000 suit, had exploded with the kind of rage that only unlimited money and desperation can fuel. 48 hours? That's what I get for $50 million in donations to this hospital? That's what I get for flying in every specialist money can buy? You're telling me my son is going to die because none of you can figure out what's wrong with him? And that's when I knew exactly what was killing David Blackstone. You see, what the brilliant doctors with their Harvard degrees and decades of experience didn't realize was that little David wasn't suffering from a rare brain tumor or some exotic virus. He had Hashimoto's encephalopathy, an autoimmune condition so rare that most physicians see maybe one case in their entire career. I knew this because 3 months ago, I had spent 17 straight hours in the Detroit Public Library researching neurological, autoimmune disorders after reading about a similar case in a discarded medical journal. I found in the hospital's dumpster. Most people throw away knowledge. I collect it. But here's the thing about being a 17-year-old. Black kid from the east side of Detroit working as a hospital janitor. When you try to tell a billionaire and a department head that you know something they don't exactly roll out the red carpet. Excuse me, Dr. Harrison, I had said, approaching them carefully near the elevators. I couldn't help but overhear about David's symptoms. The progressive encephalopathy with the steroid-responsive seizures, the psychiatric manifestations. Have you considered testing for thyroid peroxidase antibodies? The silence that followed was so thick you could have performed surgery with it. Richard Blackstone turned to look at me like I was something disgusting he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. Who the hell is this kid? Security! Dr. Harrison's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. Marcus, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be cleaning the 3rd floor. This is a private medical consultation. But sir, if David has Hashimoto's encephalopathy, the treatment protocol is completely different. You need high-dose methylprednisolone, not the standard anti-seizure medications. The inflammation markers would show, "Get this kid out of here!" Blackstone's voice boomed through the corridor, drawing stares from nurses and visitors. I don't care what sob story got him a job here. I don't want some wannabe gangbanger playing doctor with my son's life. The security guards arrived within minutes. As they escorted me away, I heard Blackstone continuing his tirade. This is exactly what's wrong with this country. These people think they can watch some medical TV show and suddenly they're neurosurgeons. My son is dying, and you're letting the cleaning staff interrupt medical discussions? That was 8 hours ago. 8 hours during which David's condition had worsened significantly. 8 hours during which the top medical minds in Michigan had continued down the wrong treatment path. 8 hours closer to a completely preventable death. And now, as I mopped the floors outside the pediatric ICU at nearly 3 a.m., I could see through the glass windows that David Blackstone was running out of time. The night shift was different at Detroit General. Fewer administrators, fewer attending physicians, and definitely fewer billionaires throwing their weight around. It was just the essential staff, nurses, residents, and people like me keeping the place running while the city slept. I had been assigned to the pediatric ICU for the past 3 months, which meant I had gotten to know most of the night nurses pretty well. Sarah Rodriguez, a 30-something single mom from the same neighborhood where I grew up, had always treated me with respect. Unlike the day shift staff who looked right through me, Sarah actually learned my name, asked about my grandmother, and sometimes shared her coffee with me during long nights. "Marcus, honey, you look troubled tonight," Sarah said as I approached the nurse's station. "Everything okay at home with your grandma?" "Grandma's fine, Miss Rodriguez." It's about the Blackstone boy." Sarah's expression immediately became guarded. Medical privacy laws meant she couldn't discuss patient information with non-medical staff, but the worry in her eyes was unmistakable. "Marcus, you know I can't—" "He's dying from the wrong treatment," I said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "They think it's a brain tumor or viral encephalitis, but it's not. It's autoimmune. His body is attacking his own brain tissue, and the medications they're giving him are making it worse." Sarah stared at me for a long moment. She had worked pediatric ICU for 12 years, had seen enough dying children to recognize when someone was running out of time. "Marcus, how could you possibly know that?" "Because I study this stuff. I know you probably think I'm just some kid with too much time on his hands, but I've been teaching myself medicine for 4 years. I read every journal I can get my hands on. I watch surgical videos online. I study case reports from hospitals around the world." "Why?" The question was simple, but her tone suggested she was starting to take me seriously. "Because my parents died in a car accident when I was 13. The emergency room doctor was inexperienced, made the wrong call, and they bled out waiting for a specialist who never came. I decided that night that I was going to learn everything I could about medicine, so that maybe someday I could save someone else's family from going through what I went through." Sarah's eyes softened. She knew my story, of course. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about the Thompson accident. What she didn't know was how that tragedy had transformed me from a regular kid into someone who spent every free hour absorbing medical knowledge like a sponge. "Marcus, even if you're right about the diagnosis, what can you do? Dr. Harrison would never listen to you after what happened today. And Mr. Blackstone? He's made it very clear how he feels about you. I need you to help me get 5 minutes alone with David's chart. Just 5 minutes to confirm what I suspect. If I'm wrong, I'll never bring this up again. But if I'm right, if you're right, that little boy lives to see his 9th birthday." The weight of that statement hung between us. Sarah looked through the glass window at David's room where his father sat slumped in a chair, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 days. "His father hasn't left his side," Sarah whispered. "Not to eat, not to sleep, barely even to use the bathroom. Yesterday I heard him on the phone with his wife, telling her to fly home from her business trip in London because they might not have much time left. Miss Rodriguez, I know this sounds crazy, but I think I can save him. Not because I'm some kind of genius, but because I've studied cases exactly like this. Hashimoto's encephalopathy presents with rapid onset neurological symptoms that mimic brain tumors or viral infections. The key is recognizing the autoimmune component and treating it with high-dose corticosteroids before permanent brain damage occurs." Sarah looked at me with new eyes. "How old are you again?" 17. "But I've been studying medicine since I was 13. 4 years of 8-hour days in medical libraries, reading everything from basic anatomy to advanced neuropharmacology. I know it sounds impossible, but I've probably read more case studies on rare neurological conditions than most residents. Even if that's true, Marcus, you're asking me to risk my job, my nursing license, maybe even criminal charges for letting a minor access patient records." She was right, of course. What I was asking was huge. But then we both heard it, the sound of alarms coming from David's room. His monitors were showing signs of another seizure. The third one in the past hour. Through the window, we could see Richard Blackstone leap from his chair as nurses rushed into the room. Dr. Patel, the overnight resident, was injecting more anti-seizure medication, following the same protocol they'd been using for 2 days. The same protocol that wasn't working. "He's getting worse," Sarah whispered, her professional instincts overriding her caution. "The seizures are lasting longer and his oxygen saturation keeps dropping." "Because they're treating the symptoms, not the cause. Miss Rodriguez, I know you took an oath to do no harm. Right now, doing nothing is causing harm. That little boy is going to die tonight unless someone has the courage to think outside the box." Sarah was quiet for almost a full minute, watching the medical team work frantically to stabilize David. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "The chart is in the computer system, password protected. Even if I logged you in, you'd need medical training to interpret the lab results, the imaging studies, the medication logs. Try me." 20 minutes later, I was staring at a computer screen that contained everything I needed to confirm my diagnosis. Sarah stood behind me, alternating between watching the hallway for approaching staff and looking over my shoulder as I scrolled through David's medical records. "Talk me through what you're seeing," she said quietly. "Explain it to me like I'm not a nurse with 12 years of experience." "Look at the timeline," I said, pointing to the admission notes. David was completely healthy 2 weeks ago. Normal development, normal behavior, good grades in school. Then, over the course of just 5 days, he developed severe headaches, behavioral changes, and his first seizure. That rules out most brain tumors, which typically have a much slower progression. What about viral encephalitis? That can have rapid onset. Good question. Look at his lumbar puncture results. The cerebrospinal fluid shows some inflammation, but the viral PCR tests all came back negative. No evidence of herpes, CMV, EBV, or any of the common encephalitis viruses. Sarah leaned closer to the screen. "So what makes you think it's this Hashimoto's thing?" "Several factors. First, look at his thyroid function tests from admission. His TSH is slightly elevated, and his free T4 is at the low end of normal. Not dramatic enough to diagnose obvious thyroid disease, but suggestive of autoimmune thyroid involvement. But his thyroid seems fine." That's the tricky part about Hashimoto's encephalopathy. It's not really about thyroid function. It's about antibodies that cross-react with brain tissue. The same antibodies that attack the thyroid can also attack neurons, causing inflammation and seizures. I scrolled to the lab results section. Here's what clinched it for me. Look at his anti-thyroid peroxidase antibodies. Sarah squinted at the screen. It says not ordered. Exactly. Nobody thought to test for them because they were focused on brain tumors and viruses. But those antibodies are the key to diagnosing Hashimoto's encephalopathy. In every case study I've read, patients with this condition have extremely elevated anti-TPO antibodies. So, you're saying the blood test that could confirm your diagnosis was never done? Right. And meanwhile, they've been giving him anti-seizure medications that don't address the underlying autoimmune process. His brain inflammation is getting worse because no one is treating the root cause. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing everything I'd explained. "Marcus, how do you know all this? I mean, really, this isn't stuff you pick up from watching Grey's Anatomy." "Because 4 years ago, when my parents died, I made a promise to myself. I was going to learn everything I could about medicine so that maybe someday I could prevent another family from losing someone they love to medical error or misdiagnosis. That's a hell of a promise for a 13-year-old to make. It changed my entire life. While other kids were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, I was in the medical library at Wayne State University, reading textbooks and journal articles. The librarians got to know me, started helping me access medical databases. I taught myself basic chemistry so I could understand pharmacology. I studied anatomy from cadaver atlases. I watched hundreds of hours of surgical videos online. Your grandmother must be proud. She thinks I'm crazy, keeps telling me I should focus on sports or music or something normal for a teenager. But she doesn't understand. This isn't just a hobby for me. It's my calling." Another alarm started sounding from David's room. Through the window, we could see Dr. Patel looking increasingly worried as he reviewed the latest lab results with the night-attending physician who had just arrived. "His condition is deteriorating faster," Sarah observed. "Even if you're right about the diagnosis, what good does it do? You can't exactly walk into that room and start prescribing medications." "No, but I can try to get the information to someone who can. Dr. Chen, the attending who just arrived, I've heard the nurses say she's actually pretty open-minded, willing to consider alternative diagnoses when standard treatments aren't working. Marcus, she's not going to listen to a 17-year-old janitor any more than Dr. Harrison did." "Maybe not. But what if the suggestion came from someone she respected? Someone with medical credentials?" Sarah looked at me suspiciously. "What are you thinking? You've been a pediatric ICU nurse for 12 years. You've seen hundreds of cases. You know these doctors personally, and they trust your clinical judgment. What if you were the one to suggest testing for anti-TPO antibodies? Marcus, I can't pretend that diagnosis came from me. That's not just unethical, it's dangerous." If I'm wrong, if this treatment makes David worse, I could lose my license, face criminal charges. But if you're right, if we're right, that little boy goes home to his family instead of... I didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what the alternative was. Sarah stared at the computer screen for a long moment, then looked through the window at David's room, where his father was holding his hand while the medical team worked frantically to control another seizure. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something you don't know about your grandmother." "What do you mean?" "Marcus, your grandmother didn't just work as a house cleaner all those years. Before you were born, before she had to raise her daughter's kids, she was a registered nurse. Worked at this very hospital for 15 years. The revelation hit me like a physical blow." "What? That's impossible. Grandma never mentioned." "She quit nursing when your mother was born, said she wanted to focus on family. But the nurses who've been here long enough still remember Dorothy Thompson. She was one of the best pediatric nurses this hospital ever had." Suddenly, so many things made sense. The way my grandmother always seemed to know when I was really sick versus just trying to skip school. Her comfort around medical terminology when we visited doctors. The fact that she never seemed surprised by my intense interest in medicine, just worried about the obsessive way I pursued it. "Does she know you work here?" "Of course she knows. But she doesn't know that I know about her nursing background. I think she's been keeping it quiet because she doesn't want you to feel pressured to follow in her footsteps, especially after what happened to your parents." "Miss Rodriguez, this changes everything. If my grandmother was a nurse here, if she had a good reputation." "She had an excellent reputation, respected by doctors, beloved by families, known for her clinical instincts and her advocacy for patients." "Would Dr. Chen remember her?" "Dr. Chen started as a resident here 25 years ago. She definitely worked with your grandmother." A plan was starting to form in my mind. It was risky, maybe even crazy, but it might be the only chance David Blackstone had. "Miss Rodriguez, how would you feel about making a phone call?" At 4:15 a.m., my grandmother arrived at Detroit General Hospital wearing the same navy blue dress she wore to church every Sunday, carrying her old nursing bag that I had never seen her open. At 72 years old, Dorothy Thompson still carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions in pediatric hospital rooms. "Marcus Anthony Thompson," she said as she approached the nurse's station, using my full name in that tone that meant I was either in serious trouble or about to be part of something important.
"Sarah called and told me what you've been up to." "Grandma, I can explain." "Child, you don't need to explain anything to me. I've been watching you study medicine for 4 years, wondering when you were going to stop reading about it and start practicing it."
Sarah stepped forward respectfully. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming. I hope I didn't overstep by calling you." "Sarah Rodriguez, you did exactly the right thing. Now tell me about this little boy who needs help." For the next 10 minutes, I explained everything to my grandmother. David's symptoms, the failed treatment attempts, my suspected diagnosis, and the resistance I'd encountered from the medical establishment. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking pointed questions that revealed just how much medical knowledge she'd retained after all these years away from nursing. "Hashimoto's encephalopathy," she said when I finished. "I saw 2 cases during my time here. Both children, both initially misdiagnosed as brain tumors. One child died before we figured it out. The other recovered completely once we started high-dose corticosteroids." "So you think I'm right about the diagnosis?" "Marcus, I think you've got better diagnostic instincts than most residents I worked with. The question is, how do we get these doctors to listen to you without damaging your credibility or Sarah's career? I was hoping you might have some ideas about that." My grandmother smiled. The same smile she used to give me when I brought home a difficult math problem that she knew I could solve if I just thought about it differently. "Dr. Lisa Chen has been working at this hospital for 25 years. She was a second-year resident when I was head nurse in the pediatric ICU. She's also one of the most humble and open-minded physicians I've ever worked with. If anyone is going to listen to an alternative diagnosis from an unexpected source, it's her. But will she remember you? Oh, she'll remember me. I saved her career once when she was a resident. Long story, but let's just say she owes me a favor." Sarah looked between my grandmother and me. "So what's the plan?"
"Simple.
my grandmother said, pulling her old stethoscope out of her nursing bag. I'm going to walk into that room, introduce myself to Dr. Chen, and suggest that she might want to consider testing for antithyroid peroxidase antibodies. When she asks where that suggestion came from, I'm going to tell her the truth, that my grandson, who has been studying medicine for 4 years, recognized the symptoms and made the connection. What if she doesn't take you seriously? Sarah, I spent 15 years building a reputation in this hospital. Dr. Chen knows that when Dorothy Thompson makes a suggestion about a pediatric patient, it's worth listening to. And what if Mr. Blackstone objects to your presence? My grandmother's expression hardened. Richard Blackstone is about to learn the difference between money and respect. Money can buy you the best doctors in the world, but it can't buy you the kind of clinical experience that comes from actually caring for sick children for 15 years. Grandma, are you sure about this? If it goes wrong, if David gets worse? Marcus, let me tell you something about medicine that all your textbooks can't teach you. Sometimes the most important thing a healthcare provider can do is have the courage to speak up when they know something is wrong, even if everyone else in the room has more degrees or more money or more authority. She stood up and straightened her dress. Your parents died because someone was too intimidated to question a senior physician's decision. I'll be damned if I let another child die because people are afraid to challenge the hierarchy. What do you need me to do? Stay out here and keep studying. If Dr. Chen wants to hear your reasoning directly, I'll call you in. But for now, let an old nurse handle the politics. As my grandmother walked toward David's room, I felt a mixture of pride and terror. This was either going to save a little boy's life or get all 3 of us banned from the hospital. Through the window, I watched her approach Dr. Chen, who was reviewing David's latest test results with obvious frustration. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Dr. Chen's face light up with recognition when my grandmother introduced herself. This is either going to work, Sarah whispered beside me, or it's going to be the most spectacular failure in Detroit general history. The conversation in David's room lasted exactly 12 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the nurse's station wall tick by each second, afraid to blink in case I missed some crucial moment that would determine whether my diagnosis would be taken seriously or dismissed entirely. Through the glass, I could see my grandmother speaking quietly with Dr. Chen while Richard Blackstone looked on with obvious impatience. At one point, Dr. Chen's eyebrows shot up and she glanced in my direction through the window. My grandmother nodded and continued explaining something, occasionally gesturing toward David's monitors. Then Dr. Chen did something that made my heart skip a beat. She pulled out her phone and started making a call. In a hospital at 4:30 a.m., there were only a few reasons for an attending physician to make urgent phone calls. Either she was calling for additional specialists, or she was ordering emergency lab tests, or... Marcus, Sarah whispered urgently. Look at Mr. Blackstone. The billionaire's expression had completely changed. The arrogance and impatience had been replaced by something that looked almost like hope. He was leaning forward in his chair, hanging on every word of Dr. Chen's phone conversation. 5 minutes later, my grandmother emerged from the room and walked back to the nurse's station with a satisfied smile on her face. Well, I asked, barely able to contain my anxiety. Dr. Chen is ordering an immediate blood draw to test for antithyroid peroxidase antibodies, antithyroglobulin antibodies, and a complete autoimmune panel. She's also calling the lab to put a rush on the results. We should have answers within 2 hours. She believed you? She believed the logic of the diagnosis. When I explained the symptom progression and the failure of standard treatments to show any improvement, she immediately recognized the pattern. Turns out she had a similar case about 10 years ago that stumped everyone until an endocrinologist suggested autoimmune encephalitis. What about Mr. Blackstone? How did he react? Once Dr. Chen explained that we might have identified the cause of David's condition and that there's an effective treatment if the diagnosis is confirmed, he stopped caring about who suggested it and started focusing on what it means for his son. Sarah shook her head in amazement. I can't believe that actually worked. The hard part isn't over yet, my grandmother warned. If the blood tests confirm Hashimoto's encephalopathy, David will need high-dose intravenous methylprednisolone for at least 5 days, possibly followed by weeks of oral corticosteroids. It's an aggressive treatment with significant side effects, and there's no guarantee that David hasn't already suffered permanent brain damage. But if it works? I asked. If it works, he should start showing improvement within 24 to 48 hours. The seizures should decrease in frequency and severity, his cognitive function should begin to return, and the brain inflammation should resolve. And if it doesn't work? My grandmother's expression grew serious. Then we've bought him a little time, but the underlying cause of his neurological deterioration remains unknown. At that point, he'll need more invasive diagnostic procedures, brain biopsy, experimental treatments, maybe even palliative care. The weight of responsibility was crushing. If I was wrong about this diagnosis, I wasn't just failing to help David, I was potentially wasting precious time that could be used pursuing other treatment options. Marcus, my grandmother said, seeming to read my thoughts, second-guessing yourself is a luxury you can't afford right now. You saw something that experienced physicians missed. You made a logical connection based on careful study and pattern recognition. That's exactly what good doctors do every day. But I'm not a doctor. I'm just a kid who reads medical textbooks. You're a young man who has dedicated 4 years of his life to understanding medicine because you want to prevent other families from experiencing the kind of loss you've experienced. That motivation makes you a better diagnostician than many people with medical degrees. Dr. Chen appeared at the nurse's station, looking tired but cautiously optimistic. Mrs. Thompson, I want to thank you for bringing this possibility to my attention. The blood draw is complete, and the lab has promised results by 6:30 a.m. Dr. Chen, I'd like you to meet my grandson, Marcus. He's the one who actually recognized the symptoms and made the diagnostic connection. Dr. Chen turned to look at me with new interest. Marcus, your grandmother tells me you've been studying medicine independently for several years. Yes, ma'am. Since I was 13. What specifically made you think of Hashimoto's encephalopathy when our neurology team was considering brain tumors and viral infections? This was my moment. Everything I had studied, every hour spent in medical libraries, every case report I had memorized, it all came down to whether I could articulate my reasoning in a way that would convince an experienced physician. The timeline was the biggest clue, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Brain tumors typically have a much slower progression, usually weeks to months rather than days. Viral encephalitis was certainly possible, but the negative PCR tests and the specific pattern of symptoms didn't quite fit. What pattern of symptoms? The combination of rapid onset seizures, behavioral changes, and cognitive decline in a previously healthy child, especially with the slightly abnormal thyroid function tests. I had read about several case reports where children with Hashimoto's encephalopathy were initially misdiagnosed because physicians focused on the neurological symptoms without considering the autoimmune component. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. That's actually quite sophisticated reasoning. Where did you encounter those case reports? Medical journals, mostly. I spend a lot of time in the Wayne State Medical Library, and the librarians have helped me access various databases. I also follow several pediatric neurology blogs and online forums where physicians discuss difficult cases. Marcus, I have to ask, what are your plans for college and medical school? The question caught me off guard. I'd love to go to medical school eventually, but it's complicated. My grandmother and I don't exactly have college tuition money saved up. We'll talk about that later, Dr. Chen said with a smile. Right now, let's focus on David. If your diagnosis is correct, what would you expect to see in terms of treatment response? High-dose methylprednisolone should start reducing the brain inflammation within 24 to 48 hours. The seizures should become less frequent and less severe. His cognitive function might take longer to improve, possibly weeks, but there should be noticeable progress within the first few days. And if there's no improvement, then either my diagnosis is wrong or David has suffered more extensive brain damage than we initially thought. Or there's an additional autoimmune process that requires different treatment. Dr. Chen looked impressed. Those are exactly the considerations I would expect from a neurology resident. Thank you. Ma'am? Dr. Chen, my grandmother interjected, there's something else you should know. Mr. Blackstone was quite dismissive of Marcus earlier today when he tried to suggest this diagnosis. He made some very inappropriate comments about Marcus's background and qualifications. Dr. Chen's expression darkened. What kind of comments? Let's just say he made assumptions based on Marcus's age, race, and job title, rather than listening to the substance of his suggestion. I see. Well, if Marcus's diagnosis proves correct, I think Mr. Blackstone is going to have some apologizing to do. That's not necessary, I said quickly. I understand why he reacted that way. His son was dying, and here's some teenager in a janitor's uniform claiming to know something that top specialists missed. I'd probably react the same way if I were in his position. Dr. Chen studied my face carefully. That's a remarkably mature perspective, Marcus. Not everyone would be so forgiving. Holding grudges doesn't save lives. If David gets better, that's all that matters. The next 2 hours felt like 2 days. Sarah let me help with some of the routine cleaning tasks to keep my hands busy while we waited for the lab results, but my mind was completely focused on David's room. Every time his monitors alarmed, every time nurses rushed in to check on him, I wondered if my diagnosis was wrong and we were wasting precious time. At 6:45 a.m., Dr. Chen's phone rang. She answered it immediately, spoke for about 30 seconds, then hung up with an expression I couldn't read. "The lab results are in," she announced, walking quickly toward David's room. My grandmother, Sarah, and I followed her, stopping just outside the doorway where we could hear but not interfere. Through the window, I could see Richard Blackstone stand up expectantly as Dr. Chen approached with a tablet containing the test results. "Mr. Blackstone, I have David's blood work back. The antithyroid peroxidase antibodies are significantly elevated, more than 10 times the normal range. The antithyroglobulin antibodies are also positive, though less dramatically elevated." "What does that mean?" Blackstone's voice was hoarse with exhaustion and hope. "It means David has Hashimoto's encephalopathy, exactly as Mrs. Thompson and her grandson suggested. His immune system is producing antibodies that are attacking his brain tissue, causing the inflammation and seizures." "But that's good news, right? If we know what's causing it, we can treat it?" "Yes, Mr. Blackstone. The treatment is high-dose corticosteroids to suppress the immune response and reduce the brain inflammation. I'm going to start David on intravenous methylprednisolone immediately. If this diagnosis is correct, we should see improvement within 24 to 48 hours. Blackstone sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Dr. Chen, how did you figure this out when all the other specialists missed it?" "I didn't figure it out, Mr. Blackstone. The suggestion came from Mrs. Dorothy Thompson, who used to be one of our best pediatric nurses here at Detroit General. She recognized the symptom pattern based on cases she had seen during her 15 years of nursing experience." "Mrs. Thompson? I don't understand. Who is she?" "She's the grandmother of Marcus Thompson, the young man you met yesterday, the one who initially tried to suggest this diagnosis." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. Through the window, I watched Richard Blackstone's face cycle through several emotions: confusion, recognition, and finally, what looked like shame. The janitor? The kid I had security throw out? Marcus isn't just a janitor, Mr. Blackstone. He's been studying medicine independently for 4 years. He recognized your son's symptoms based on case studies he'd read, and he made the diagnostic connection that may have saved David's life. "Oh my God." Blackstone put his head in his hands. I called him. I said horrible things. I assumed he was just some kid trying to get attention. "Mr. Blackstone, Marcus harbors no ill will toward you. He understands that you were frightened for your son and reacted defensively. His only concern has been David's welfare. Where is he now?" I need to apologize. He's right outside, waiting to hear whether his diagnosis was correct." Blackstone stood up and walked toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, his eyes met mine for the first time since yesterday's confrontation. But instead of the anger and dismissal I had seen before, his expression showed something I hadn't expected: genuine remorse. "Marcus," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. Mr. Blackstone, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do. I judged you based on your age and your job and your appearance, and I nearly cost my son his life because of my prejudice. You tried to help David, and I had you thrown out of the hospital. Sir, you were scared for your son. Any parent would have reacted the same way." "No, Marcus. Any bigot would have reacted the way I did. A good parent would have listened to anyone who might be able to help his child, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from." The admission hung in the air between us. This was clearly not easy for Richard Blackstone to say, but he was saying it anyway. "Marcus, Dr. Chen tells me you want to go to medical school." "Yes, sir, eventually, if I can figure out how to afford it." "Consider it figured out. Full tuition, room and board, whatever medical school you want to attend. It's the least I can do for someone who saved my son's life." "Mr. Blackstone, that's incredibly generous, but But nothing. You have a gift, Marcus. You see things that experienced doctors miss. The world needs more physicians like you, and I'm going to make sure you get the chance to become one. My grandmother stepped forward. Mr. Blackstone, that's a very kind offer, but Marcus hasn't even finished high school yet. Let's see how David responds to treatment before we start making college plans. Of course, you're absolutely right. David's recovery comes first. Dr. Chen approached with a syringe containing the first dose of methylprednisolone. Mr. Blackstone, I'm going to start David's treatment now. The medication will be given intravenously over the next hour, and we'll monitor his response closely. How soon will we know if it's working? If Marcus's diagnosis is correct, we should see a reduction in seizure activity within 12 to 24 hours. Full recovery typically takes several weeks, but the initial improvement should be noticeable fairly quickly. As Dr. Chen administered the medication, I found myself holding my breath. Everything I had studied, everything I thought I knew about medicine, was about to be tested in the most real way possible. If David didn't improve, if I was wrong about this diagnosis, then I wasn't just failing academically, I was failing a family whose entire world depended on getting this right. Marcus, my grandmother said softly, you've done everything you could. Now we wait and see what happens. What if I'm wrong, Grandma? What if all my studying and reading was just academic theory that doesn't translate to real patients? Then you learn from it and keep studying. But Marcus, I've been a nurse for long enough to recognize good diagnostic instincts when I see them. You may be 17 years old, but you think like a physician. Richard Blackstone overheard our conversation. Marcus, regardless of what happens with David's treatment, you've already proven something important. You cared enough about a stranger's child to risk humiliation and rejection in order to try to help. That's the kind of person we want practicing medicine. Thank you, sir. Call me Richard. And Marcus, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the way I treated you yesterday. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, it was clear that something was changing. David's seizures, which had been occurring every 2 to 3 hours, had stopped completely. His brainwave patterns on the EEG were showing signs of improvement, and most importantly, he was more alert and responsive than he had been in days. Daddy? David's voice was weak but clear as he woke up from his longest period of peaceful sleep in a week. Why are you crying? Richard Blackstone wiped tears from his eyes as he leaned over his son's hospital bed. I'm crying because you're getting better, buddy. You're going to be okay. Was I sick? Very sick. But some very smart people figured out how to make you better. David looked around the room with curious eyes that were brighter and more focused than they had been since his admission. Can I have some ice cream? The laughter that filled the room was the sound of pure relief. For the first time in days, David was acting like a normal 8-year-old boy, asking for ice cream and wondering why everyone around him looked so emotional. Dr. Chen checked David's neurological responses, testing his reflexes, coordination, and cognitive function. This is remarkable improvement. His motor function is normal, his speech is clear, and his cognitive responses are age-appropriate. So the treatment is working? Richard asked. The treatment is working beautifully. We'll continue the high-dose steroids for the rest of the week, then gradually taper them down over the next month. But David should be able to go home in a few days. Dr. Chen, I can't thank you enough for listening to Mrs. Thompson's suggestion. Don't thank me, Richard. Thank the young man who made the diagnosis. David looked confused. Who made me better? Richard smiled. His name is Marcus, and he's a very special person who knew exactly what was wrong with you when all the grown-up doctors were confused. Can I meet him? I think that can be arranged. 15 minutes later, I found myself standing next to David's bed, feeling more nervous than I had during any medical emergency. Talking to doctors and nurses about diagnoses was one thing, but explaining to an 8-year-old why he had been so sick was something entirely different. Hi, David, I'm Marcus. Hi. My daddy says you're the one who figured out how to make me better. Well, I had some help from your doctors and my grandmother. We all worked together. Are you a doctor? Not yet. I'm still in high school, but I want to be a doctor someday. Cool. Will you be my doctor when you're done with school? I laughed. That might be a while, David. By the time I finish medical school, you'll probably be in college yourself. That's okay. I'll wait. Richard Blackstone stepped forward. Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. The scholarship offer still stands, but I'd like to add something to it. Sir? I want to offer you a position working with my company's research division during your summers off from college. You'd be working with some of the top medical researchers in the country, getting hands-on experience with clinical trials and drug development. Mr. Black, Richard, that's incredibly generous. It's not generosity, Marcus, it's investment. You have a gift for seeing medical problems from unique angles. That's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to breakthrough treatments and cures. What kind of research does your company do? We develop medications for rare diseases, conditions that affect small numbers of patients but cause tremendous suffering. Diseases like the one David had, where conventional medicine often fails because there's not enough research or awareness. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard Blackstone's pharmaceutical company specialized in exactly the kind of rare conditions that I had been studying in medical journals for the past 4 years. I'd love to learn more about that kind of research. Good. But first, you need to finish high school and get into a good pre-med program. Have you thought about where you want to apply for college? Honestly, I've been so focused on just surviving high school and helping my grandmother with expenses that I haven't really considered college options. I assumed I'd probably go to Wayne State or maybe University of Michigan if I could get financial aid. Marcus, with your diagnostic abilities and my financial backing, you could get into any medical school in the country. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Mayo, wherever you want to go. The conversation was starting to feel surreal. 24 hours ago, I was just a teenager working as a hospital janitor, trying to pay my grandmother's medical bills and dreaming of someday becoming a doctor. Now, I was being offered a full scholarship to medical school by one of the richest men in America. Richard, I appreciate everything you're offering, but I want to make sure you understand something. I didn't help David because I wanted anything in return. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I know that, Marcus. That's exactly why I want to help you achieve your goals. The world needs more doctors who are motivated by helping people rather than making money. What about my grandmother? I can't just abandon her to go off to some fancy college. Marcus, my grandmother interjected, I've been taking care of myself for 72 years. I think I can manage a few more while you're getting your education. But the medical bills, the rent, the groceries will all be taken care of, Richard said. Part of your scholarship package will include a living allowance for your grandmother, health insurance, and anything else she needs. That's too much. I can't accept that. Marcus, you saved my son's life. There's no amount of money that can repay that debt. This isn't charity. It's gratitude. David, who had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus that only 8-year-olds can muster, suddenly spoke up. Marcus, if you become a doctor, will you help other sick kids like me? That's the plan, David. Then you have to take my daddy's money. Because if you don't become a doctor, then other kids might not get better like I did. Sometimes children see things more clearly than adults. David was right. This wasn't about me accepting charity or feeling uncomfortable about Richard's gratitude. This was about making sure I had the resources to help other patients in the future. Okay, I said finally. I accept your offer. All of it. Good. Now, let's talk about your high school graduation. When do you finish? Actually, I'm ahead on credits. I've been taking accelerated courses and summer school for the past 2 years. I could graduate in December if I wanted to. Perfect. That means you could start college in January or take a gap semester and start in the fall. What sounds better to you? I think I'd like to start as soon as possible. I've been waiting to begin my real medical education for 4 years. Dr. Chen, who had been listening to our conversation while checking on David's IV, smiled. Marcus, have you considered which medical specialty interests you most? I've always been drawn to emergency medicine and diagnostic medicine. I like the challenge of figuring out what's wrong with patients when the answer isn't obvious. Based on what I've seen today, you'd make an excellent emergency physician, or maybe an internist specializing in rare diseases. Or both, Richard suggested. Marcus, I'd love for you to spend this summer working with our research team before you start college. You could get a head start on understanding how medical research translates into actual treatments. I'd love that. Great. I'll have my assistant set up meetings with our research directors next week. Sarah, who had been watching this entire conversation unfold, finally spoke up. Marcus, I have to say, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen happen at this hospital. Yesterday, you were emptying trash cans, and today you're being offered scholarships to medical school. It doesn't feel real yet. It's real, my grandmother said firmly. And it's what your parents would have wanted for you. They'd be so proud of what you've accomplished. Grandma, do you think they would have approved of me studying medicine? Marcus, your father always said you had a mind that could solve any problem you set it to. Your mother used to joke that you'd probably end up saving the world somehow. I think they'd be thrilled to know you're going to be saving lives. Richard Blackstone cleared his throat. Marcus, there's one more thing I'd like to discuss with you. What's that? I want to establish a scholarship fund in your name, the Marcus Thompson Scholarship for Exceptional Medical Students. It would provide full funding for students from underprivileged backgrounds who show exceptional diagnostic abilities and dedication to helping others. You want to name a scholarship after me? Marcus, you proved today that medical genius can come from anywhere. There are probably other teenagers out there with your abilities who never get the chance to develop them because they don't have the financial resources or family support. This scholarship would help identify and support those students. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Help me find the next Marcus Thompson. I looked around the room at all the people who had become part of this incredible day. My grandmother, who had revealed her own medical background to help me succeed. Sarah, who had risked her career to give me a chance. Dr. Chen, who had been open-minded enough to listen to an unconventional suggestion. Richard, who had overcome his own prejudices to recognize value in an unexpected place. And David, who was living proof that sometimes the most important knowledge comes from the most unlikely sources. Yes, I said, I'd be honored to have a scholarship program in my name. Excellent. I'll have my legal team start working on the details next week. David, who had been following the conversation with growing excitement, suddenly sat up in his bed. Marcus, does this mean you're going to be famous? I don't know about famous, David. I think you're going to be famous. You're going to be on TV and in magazines because you saved my life. As it turned out, David was right about the media attention. By evening, word had spread throughout the hospital about the teenage janitor who had diagnosed a condition that stumped multiple specialists. Local news stations picked up the story, then national outlets, then international media. But as I watched, David playing video games on his hospital bed, looking like any normal 8-year-old boy instead of a dying child, I realized that fame was never the point. The point was exactly what David had said earlier, making sure that other sick kids got the help they needed. Richard, I said as we prepared to leave for the evening, I want to make sure the scholarship program focuses on students who are motivated by helping others, not just those with high test scores. Absolutely. How do you think we should evaluate candidates? Community service, volunteer work at hospitals or clinics, demonstrated commitment to working with underserved populations. Academic ability is important, but character matters more. I couldn't agree more. My grandmother packed her nursing bag with the same care she had shown when arriving 12 hours earlier. Marcus, you ready to go home? Actually, Grandma, I was wondering if we could stop by the library on the way home. The library? Marcus, after everything that's happened today, you want to go study? Not study exactly. I want to check out some books on autoimmune disorders and pediatric neurology. If I'm going to be working with Richard's research team this summer, I want to make sure I'm prepared. Richard Blackstone laughed. Marcus, most teenagers who just got offered full scholarships to medical school would want to celebrate, not study more. But if I don't keep learning, how am I going to help the next David? And that, I realized, was the real answer to everything. Not the scholarships or the research opportunities or the media attention, but the simple commitment to keep learning so that I could keep helping people who needed it. As we walked out of Detroit General Hospital that night, I looked back at the building where my life had changed forever. Tomorrow, I would still be 17 years old, still living in the same neighborhood, still helping my grandmother with the bills. But everything else was different now. I was no longer just a kid who dreamed of becoming a doctor someday. I was someone who had already proven that medicine was my calling, and that calling was going to take me places I had never imagined possible. 3 months later, I was sitting in my first college-level biochemistry class at the University of Michigan, having graduated high school a semester early and enrolled in their accelerated pre-med program. Richard had been true to his word about the scholarship. Tuition, room, board, textbooks, and a living allowance for my grandmother were all covered. But the most important change wasn't financial. It was the confidence that came from knowing I belonged in medical settings, that my voice mattered when it came to patient care, and that my background, rather than being a limitation, was actually a strength that gave me perspectives other medical students didn't have. David had made a complete recovery. His neurological function was normal, he was back in school, and he visited me on campus every few months with his father. Richard had kept his promise about the research opportunity as well. I spent my summer working with his company's rare disease division, learning about drug development and clinical trials. The Marcus Thompson Scholarship had received over 2,000 applications in its first year. We funded 12 students from backgrounds similar to mine, kids who had grown up in challenging circumstances, but had demonstrated exceptional dedication to learning medicine and helping others, but the most meaningful change was personal. Every time I put on my white coat for anatomy lab, every time I studied for an exam, every time I volunteered at the free clinic downtown, I thought about David Blackstone and the night that changed everything. I had learned that medicine wasn't just about memorizing facts or passing tests. It was about having the courage to speak up when you see something others miss, even if you're the youngest person in the room. It was about understanding that knowledge without compassion is worthless, but compassion without knowledge can be dangerous. And most importantly, it was about never letting someone's assumptions about your background prevent you from using your abilities to help others. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Marcus, I got an A on my science test today. My teacher says I might want to be a doctor like you someday. I smiled and texted back, that's awesome, David. Keep studying hard. The world needs more doctors who understand what it's like to be patients. As I walked across campus toward my next class, I thought about all the future patients I would someday have the privilege to help. Some would be billionaires' children, others would be kids from the projects. Some would have obvious diagnoses, others would present medical mysteries that challenged everything I thought I knew. But regardless of who they were or what conditions they had, I would approach each case with the same principles that had guided me that night at Detroit General. Listen carefully. Think beyond conventional wisdom. Advocate fearlessly for your patients. And never let prejudice or hierarchy prevent you from doing what's right. Because sometimes the most important medical knowledge doesn't come from textbooks or medical schools. Sometimes it comes from the heart of a 17-year-old who refuses to let a child die simply because the adults in the room are too proud to listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's exactly what saves a life.